Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Hey guys, hope you're all doing well. Just down here in the dungeon doing a little work here this evening, and this past weekend, one of my brothers, one of the closest people to me outside of blood family, did his first solo doubling run. And he did a great job at it. Made a really good product. Didn't probably get his heads to hearts cut quite right, and probably threw out way more heads than he needed to. But he made good product, and that's all that matters. And he did it without a whole lot of guidance. Now, he did strip his mash back in December, so I'm going to say that he's the only person I know that ages his own low wines, or ages low wines, period. That's a new one on me, but you know, you get busy in life and things happen, and that's the way it works out sometimes. But it did get me thinking about, you know, the fact that what is a good path for self-education when it comes to distillation, right? And as you guys know, this channel, One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute, it's definitely not catered to beginners. And the reason that it's not is because there's plenty of folks out there who do cater to the beginner, and they do a great job of it. But you know, once you're past that beginning stage, it starts to become a little harder to find information that is reliable and trustworthy. And so I wanted to lean more heavily into that, in particular in the home distilling community, most of all. So that's why I really focus on the more advanced stuff. The other guys that are doing the beginner level stuff, they do a great job, but it still is a great question. What is a good course? And I don't mean like a study course. I guess it is a study course to some degree. What is a good course of distillations for a beginner to teach themselves and use simple observation to learn various mechanisms, right? As opposed to just bouncing around from recipe to recipe, etc., etc. Which you can do, but I think that there's a better way to do it. And of course, reading is a part of this. You know, one of the things that I did was I found everything I could on the internet. I talked to all the distillers that I could, and then when I ran out of that stuff, I started buying old school distilling manuals, in all honesty, and going through those manuals from the 1700s, 1800s, early 20th century, etc., and learned as much as I could from them and experimented with them. But I also did a great deal of practical distillation and fermentation. And so, thinking this through in some ways, I kind of came up with a rough outline in my head of if I were advising someone that was new to distillation, maybe my brother that I just talked about, of ways to learn and not get overwhelmed. I think this is what I would do. So I pretty much always advise everyone to start with a sugar shine. And when I say sugar shine, I mean 1 pound of grain, 1 pound of sugar per gallon, 1 ounce of or 1 gram of yeast per gallon, right? And then I typically advise them, you know, run that off, leave the grain behind, unless you have a still that you can run grain in. Leave the grain behind, take a little bit of your spent mash from your still, throw that back on that grain bed, add sugar to it, fill it back up, re-ferment it. It's called Uncle Jesse's Simple Sour Mash Method. Works great, makes good product for what it is. It's always a little hot, it has that sugar bowl sort of thing to it that we've talked about many times here on the channel, but there's nothing wrong with it, and you can run the same grain bed multiple times. I've done it up to 8 times. I wouldn't necessarily advise doing it up to 8 times, but you can do it up to 8 times. And I made good product all the way up to 8 circulations off that same grain bed. But nonetheless, so where do you go from there? Well, here's what I suggest. Again, 1 pound of grain per gallon, start with corn. 1 pound of sugar per gallon, 1 gram of yeast per gallon. Run that initially, in my opinion, run it double pot still. Do a stripping run on it, collect all the alcohol you can off of it, take that alcohol, put it back into another still, and run it a second time, a smaller still. Or run several strips until you get enough to fill your still again to do your doubling run. Learn how to do your cuts off your doubling run. Sour mash that, do it again, do it again. Get your 6, 7 generations of sour mash off of it that you can, running double pot still mode. Next time you get ready to mash in the exact same thing. 1 pound of corn per gallon, 1 pound of sugar per gallon, and 1 gram of yeast per gallon. Run that with a thumper. Learn your cuts on the fly there, off of your thumper. See how the thumper differs from the double pot still methodology. When you get done with that, and you're 6 generations off of it, or however many generations you do, maybe then play around with a different grain, or adding a modifying grain, a modifying small grain. Play with a different yeast strain. Run that double pot still one time, run it pot still and thumper one time. See what I mean? You're learning as you go here. These are simple observational things. And then before you move on to anything more complicated, a cereal mash or anything of that nature whatsoever, period, play around with your equipment. Do you like the double pot still better, or do you like the pot and thumper? Well, what happens when you have reflux? What happens if you have reflux in a plate? What happens if you have reflux in 4 plates? What happens if you have a shell and tube condenser versus a worm condenser? Right? Figure out your options here. What happens when you take that finished sugar shine with the hearts cut and everything made to it, and you turn it into a gin? Now you've mastered a sugar shine. You've done all the things with a sugar shine you can, with all the different equipment that you can, with all the different variations that you possibly can. You know exactly what to expect out of a sugar shine in pretty much every given circumstance. You know what a sugar shine does when it has a little oats added to it. You know what it does when it has some rye added to it. You know what it does when it's straight rye with sugar. You know what it does when it's straight wheat with sugar, right? You've experienced those things. Maybe not mastered them yet, but you've got a pretty good idea of what's going to happen when you run that mash bill and when you run a specific set of equipment, a specific piece of equipment. This is very much so the way that I really taught myself initially, right? I was very curious about A, what the fermentation did, and B, what the equipment did. Now, I did jump around a little bit, and that's why I'm giving this advice, because I think I could have done this better. The next thing you do, maybe make an all grain. Do it with enzymes the first time, right? Use exogenous enzymes to convert everything. Maybe use a little sugar to bump the ABV. Maybe you don't use any sugar to bump the ABV. Run it double pot still one time. Run that same mash bill again. Run it pot and thumper. Run it reflux. Get some neutral grain off of it, or some 170 off of it. Maybe then run a gin out of it, or an absinthe out of it, right? I should have said there's probably a stage in between here. So the other stage would be after you get done with the grain sugar shine, move over to fruit sugar shines. There's a lot to play with there, right? You can do the old mash stuff that we talked about, the old Hoosier apple brandy variety, where you core the apple and then grind up the entirety of the apples and throw those into the wash and cook it in with boiling water, and then throw some sugar to it and raise the potential ABV. You can do it with straight up juice, store-bought juice or pressed juice, whatever you can get a hold of, right? You can play around with different kinds of sugar with it. Same thing with rums or sugar shines if you want to. Vanilla sugar, brown sugar, white sugar, etc. Those are really easy things to do, like very simple things to do. And you know, you start to master those fermentations, then you move into the equipment thing. And even with the sugar shines, there's also the thing there where with the fermentation alone, not counting the yeast of the various grains, you can also learn to invert sugar. Well, now you're learning what you really like the taste of, right? I just think that those are all things that you could work through, and you could learn much more easily that way. And maybe you don't have all that equipment right now. Maybe you don't even want to play with that kind of equipment. But I think if you want to really learn and master the art of distillation, those are goals to set, right? You can find ways to make money wherever you can make money and how you can make money, and set that money back and buy some extra equipment, buy some better grain, buy some better sugars, buy better equipment as you go, and use that equipment to teach yourself, right? Nowadays with these modular stills, with all the various triclos, I mean, hell, man, it's the erector set for an alcoholic adult is what it really is. So there's a lot there you can do, you know. And then once you get into that all grain thing, like we talked about earlier, you start with exogenous enzymes, then switch over to try and, you know, malt for enzymes instead of exogenous enzymes. Learn how malt works. Learn how to really build a beer recipe that is efficient, not only in its conversion but also in its rate of fermentation. Learn how to do that whole thing, right? Those are the ways that you can kind of build into it, right? You go from very, very simple sugar shine, 1 pound of corn, 1 pound of sugar, 1 gram of yeast per gallon, through all the permutations, double pot still and thumper, reflux with a plate, reflux with 4 plates. Make that into a gin, brandy, apple mash, 1 pound of apples per gallon, 1 pound of sugar per gallon, 1 gram of yeast per gallon. You play with your various different yeasts, see what they do. Run it through a pot still, run it through a pot and thumper, run it with 1 plate, run it with 4 plates, make a gin out of it, right? Apple brandy from juice, same thing, rinse and repeat. Grain with exogenous enzymes, rinse and repeat. Grain with malt conversion, rinse and repeat. And through those simple observations and those little learning steps, and yes, you may have to ask people questions as you go, but it's an obvious progression, right? You're not doing a sugar shine one time and running as a sweet mash and doing double pot still and then going, I think next I'm going to do a 6-grain bourbon, right? And I'm going to run 1 plate and reflux on it. I'm going to run a shell and tube condenser on it. It's not a logical progression, nor is it one that I think that you easily learn from, because I think you get dissuaded by the failures that you have when you go that path, right? Stick it out, learn the basics, get the basics, stick those basics, then advance, right? Get the basic equipment, stick the basics of those equipment, of that equipment, then buy a new piece. Stick that, buy a new piece. Stick that, buy a new piece, right? I don't know if any of that's making any sense to any of you out there, and I don't know if it helps any of you out there, but that was just something that was kind of running through my head, and I think that there's some, I hesitate to use the word wisdom when I'm talking about myself because it makes me sound like a pretentious douchebag, and I don't like that. But that's a little bit of wisdom I can give you. That's how I taught myself, right? I didn't necessarily have anybody to really teach me these things. That's how I taught myself. That's how I learned. I didn't jump into complicated things immediately. I didn't even really jump into absinthe, proper absinthe, until very late in my career. And there's a reason I call it the distiller's thesis, right? Learn all those basic things. Work your way up to it, right? The one thing that I missed out on in logical steps was I never did much flavored moonshine. And so therefore, when it comes to post-distillation flavoring, I'm not the best at it in the world. That's my flaw. That's my weakness. But I also don't rely on selling a lot of flavored liquor in my professional distillery. So maybe it's a flaw, maybe it's not. It's worked out okay for me so far. Anyways, guys, as always, reach out to me at bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. Check out thealchemistcabinet.com. There's 2 books on there, The Alchemist Cabinet Volume 1 and Volume 2. Have tons of recipes and advice in there, and they are linear in the way that they progress from Volume 1 to Volume 2. Volume 3 is coming soon. You can order that from us. We'll autograph it, get it sent out to you, and that whole thing. And be sure to check out the Distillers Talk podcast and the One Piece at a Time Sacred and Profane podcast. Getting ready to put up 2 or 3 new episodes here in the coming week. So, all right. Oh, also, you can reach out to me in the YouTube comments below and or social media. All right. Love you guys. Later.